Hi, this is Matt McCormick. I'm in the philosophy department at California State University, Sacramento. This is the second lecture on Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, chapters 19 through 24. This section of the book is about overconfidence. There's a previous lecture, and this one will wrap up our discussion of this part of the book. I'm taking, among other things, an evolutionary approach to what's going on in Kahneman to try to make some sense out of the various biases, distortions, or tilts that human cognitive systems take when they make decisions. It turns out Kahneman and a host of other um, researchers in the 20th century, 21st century have thoroughly tested and experimented and explored the landscape of how humans view decisions, how they retell or recount decisions, how they make decisions, and they've discovered a bunch of really interesting wrinkles in the way that we think about our choices and the kinds of choices we make, how we frame them, and discovered some really consistent and surprising outcomes or outputs to the way the patterns in the way we think. So the bigger issue that we're talking about in this portion of the course is this phenomena of overconfidence. And I've said previously that evolution has created a system that, out of necessity, has to operate in very often, very frequently in this day-to-day life when you're trying to acquire enough calories to survive, when you're trying to avoid obstacles or hazards or deadly threats, predators, and so on. It's up to the operating system, the system that's running the hominids' decisions, to make quick choices and choose as fast as possible on the basis of very little information. We often don't have time or the luxury or the calories or the safety to be able to do comprehensive research and investigation into the situation we're in. You've got to dodge that falling rock, or you've got to quickly decide that that's a predator chasing you and run away, or otherwise make hasty decisions. So we're not surprised then to find that there's a larger pattern in human decision making, that system one in particular makes quick decisions on the basis of very little information, and then it's overconfident about the quality of those decisions. And that's really been the discussion here in this section of the book about our overconfidence, both looking back at decisions we made in the past and looking forward about predictions about what we think is going to happen in the future. Okay, so part two then is going to cover several topics. One of them Kahneman calls the illusion of validity. System one is designed to jump to conclusions from very little evidence. The what you see is all there is phenomena contributes. We have confidence about the coherence of our stories, and our subjective confidence reflects the coherence of the story. One and two build together. The actual amount and quality of evidence doesn't matter to us, even in the face of counter evidence proving the inadequacy of our abilities to make predictions. The illusion of validity and expertise persists. Even when we've got good evidence that shows we're not good at what we're making our choices about, we're not as expert as we think, the illusion that the information I've got is valid and works and will give me good decisions persists, and I don't revise this optimistic attitude about my abilities. And this also comes out in something he calls the illusion of skill. And he picks on stock traders, although this illusion is going to apply to everybody. But I like the stock market trader examples. It turns out that stock traders do no better than dart throwing monkeys at picking winning stocks and selling losing ones. In fact, they tend to do the opposite. They often trade too much and actually lose over time. Yet their confidence, their bonuses for their success, and their assurances that they can predict the market persist. That they still think, despite the counter evidence, that they're really good at this, as we all are when we think that we're skilled at some task. So we're going to look at the research about expert intuition and the way formulas sometimes can replace more nuanced or more chaotic human decisions, and we're going to look at something called statistical prediction rules and how they can often do better quality decision making than what humans come up with on their own on the fly. And we're going to look at something that Kahneman calls the outside view, and we're going to revisit something that I've already shared with you in this class. It was an early journal assignment about the planning fallacy that fits nicely into this part of Kahneman's discussion. All right, so let's talk about expert stock pickers and the illusion of skill. Kahneman says, overconfidence, hindsight bias, outcome bias, confirmation bias, all of which we've now discussed and studied, and other distortions bolster people's beliefs that they understand the stock market, for example, that they can predict and see trends, that they know why some stocks go up and why others go down, and that they have a good grasp on something as vast and complicated as the global economy. Now, this is just a single case. We're talking about the stock market, but you can see how this would apply to all sorts of cases where somebody's making predictions and somebody has some foresight into what they think is going to happen next in any kind of complicated system they're embedded. So here's a simple question that Kahneman asks that sort of exposes what's going on here. Who does better on the stock market overall, men or women? Now, most people's intuition here is probably going to be, and there's lots of male stock market brokers who will tell you that men are better at it, that they pay more attention, they have more information about it, they have more nuanced judgment about it, they care, and they therefore have better information and do better. Well, it turns out they're wrong. Women do better than men on the stock market when you compare like for like. Why? Well, here's why. It's because women tend to put their money into the market and then they leave it alone. They just invest it and they let it grow in value. Men, overconfident in their understanding of the market, tend to buy and sell more. They tinker, they meddle, they make day trades, they try to catch trends, they make predictions, they feel like they understand what's going to happen, and they try to ride these waves and make money at it. So overall, because the women put their money in and leave it there, they end up making more on average than men do, because the men not only making all these trades, which actually turn out to be to their detriment, they sell the stocks they should have kept, and they buy the stocks they should have avoided, but they're also paying fees on every one of those exchanges, and that's cutting into their returns over the long haul. And we'll see more about that in just a minute. Okay, so in order to sell stocks and to make money, of course, you need to do two things. You need to sell the stocks that then subsequently start losing value. So you sold it and you got your money out of it, and then the stock starts losing value. So now the person who bought it now has less than they paid for it. So they take the loss. And on the other side, you want to buy stocks that subsequently start gaining value, right? So if you had a time machine, the thing you should have done is go back to the 90s and buy Microsoft stock, or go back to the 2000s and buy Google stock. Right? And then those gain value, and you gain all that wealth as a result of the improvement in value. Okay, but stockbrokers tend to sell the stocks they own and buy the ones they don't because they expect the value of the ones they own to go down and the value of the ones that they buy to go up, right? Because they expect these two different trends to happen. Well, when Terry O'Dean, says Kahneman, from UC Berkeley, analyzed the performance of these stocks, what pattern emerged? It turns out that on average, the opposite happens. They sell and then those stocks go up, and they buy and those stocks go down. So actually, on average, stock market brokers tend to do the opposite of what they should do. They sell the ones that then increase in value, that's money they could have made, or they buy the ones that lose money, and that's money that they lose. Now, this is all happening on a large scale because there's somebody out there who's buying them and there's somebody else who's selling them, and this kind of averages out. But overall, what happens is people lose in the big picture. Philip Tetlock did a bunch of a comprehensive, really thorough examination of the data on this and came to this now famous conclusion that they do no better than dart-throwing monkeys at picking winning stocks. And that got picked up by all the news. And we'll talk about Tetlock's book here in just a minute. Okay, so let me tell you about a story. Something that happened with Warren Buffett, famous investor who's actually quite conservative and leaves his money alone in mixed index funds. And Buffett, who is suspicious of hedge fund managers in particular, who tend to buy and sell and tend to think that they can predict what's going to win and what's going to lose, in 2007, Warren Buffett, that's the guy on the right, made this bet. He said, in 10 years from this date, my choice of a standard leave it alone index fund, where you just put your money in there and walk away from it, don't mess with it, it will outperform any micromanaged hedge fund. So he put this challenge out there, said, I will bet you, here's what we'll do. I'm going to put $1 million into one of these index funds and leave it alone. And then I bet the performance of it over the long term will do better than one of these micromanaged hedge funds that are built on the idea that this hedge fund manager has some great powerful insight into the patterns and the trends and tracks the stock market and keeps moving funds back and forth across different stocks. Okay, so this CEO from Protege Partners, the hedge fund, accepted Buffett's challenge. He accepted the gamble. He said, our purpose for accepting Buffett's challenge was to inform the public about the benefits of hedge fund investing for sophisticated institutional investors. Now, he might have been just doing this to get some PR, but this is potentially really embarrassing. So here's what happened. This guy Sides, his hedge fund return on $1 million. So Buffett and Sides both put $1 million into their respective investments, and then they waited out the 10 years to see what happened. Sides made $220,000 in increased value on his hedge fund out of his $1 million investment. So he got like a 22% return on investment over 10 years. Buffett's return on $1 million low-fee index fund was $854,000. So Buffett nearly doubled his money in that 10 years. He got 85% return on investment over that 10 years compared to the other guy's 22% investment. So it was a resounding answer to this debate over which kind of funds are better to invest in, and Buffett wins the bet by a long shot. And he says he's very suspicious of all the managing, the micromanaging. And he says when trillions of dollars are managed by Wall Streeters charging high fees, and that's really where people like Sides are making their money. They're charging fees for people to do the switches and do the trades. It will usually be the managers who reap outsized profits, not the clients. So Buffett's suspicious of those types of funds. Protege Partners was not available for comment after this 10-year bet closed, seeming to support Kahneman's point about strategies for investing successfully. Okay, so complex systems with outputs that are in part the result of luck produce disparate results that are very hard to predict. When you get a big complicated machine like the stock market, or an airport, or any kind of very complicated system where a good bit of luck makes a difference into huge differences in outcome with what's going to unfold in the future with the system, it makes it very, very hard to predict what's going to happen. And our systems build narratives about those results that include our being able to predict better than we can. They make us think, they hide our mistakes from ourselves, they boost our confidence, and they portray us as having more skill and control than we actually have over the things that are happening in front of us. But what they do is they ignore luck. Okay, so I'm going to take a brief aside here and talk about some of the evidence here about what's going on with the human brain and evolution. So Daniel Dennett and, I can't remember McKay's first name, wrote a really important article about 10, 15 years ago called The Evolution of Misbelief. And they were looking at all of the evidence about whether or not we should think that evolution built us or equipped us to have false beliefs. And they run through a whole bunch of categories of different kinds of false beliefs where people have said or made some argument or other that there looks like there's some evolved adaptive advantage to having certain kinds of false beliefs. Dennett and McKay end up finishing, Ryan McKay is his name, Dennett and McKay end up concluding that one category of misbelief that humans have appears to have evolved in us for some pretty powerful arguments, and they call this category positive illusions. And it fits very nicely with what Kahneman has to say here. They say unrealistically positive self-appraisals and beliefs, exaggerated perceptions of personal control or mastery, and unrealistic optimism about the future. That's positive illusions, and we all have these. And they also coined this term, they called it the better than average effect. People tend to think that I will live longer, I'm more honest, I'm more persistent, I'm more original, I'm more friendly, I'm more reliable, I'm a better driver than average. Even when somebody's sitting in the hospital because of a car wreck that they were involved in, Everybody thinks they're above average. But of course, not everybody can be above average. Somebody's got to be below average for it to average out to be the average, right? Nobody wants to say, I'm an average driver. I'm going to have an average lifespan. I have average health, average fitness, average honesty, average persistence, right? I mean, all of that sounds really quite embarrassing and incriminating. In fact, they say, in fact, most people view themselves as better than average on almost any dimension that is both subjectively and socially desirable. So if it's positive, people go, oh yeah, I'm better at that. Indeed, with exquisite irony, most people even see themselves as less prone to such self-serving distortions than others. And I think they call this the bias. When you ask people, are you below average, average, or better than average at identifying cases where you have self-serving delusions? And people go, oh no, I'm better than average at detecting myself making mistakes, right? So there's a powerful irony in that. 95% of people judge their partners more positively than the average partner with respect to intelligence. My wife is more intelligent than other people, than other women. My wife's more attractive. She's more warm. She has a better sense of humor. Vice versa about my husband, right? They only have positive things to say about their spouses because, of course, that reflects positively on them. And the same, it gets even more delusional for parents. The ability of parents to deny the faults of their children sometimes seems to border on delusion, right? Even the mother of a serial killer refuses to admit that he's not a good boy. Okay, so Dennett and McKay have got a lot to add, and I highly recommend that article. Just Google Dennett and McKay, The Evolution of Misbelief. It's a really powerful, interesting set of arguments about the research surrounding some of this stuff that Kahneman's talking about. Okay, now the other book, and the other person I talked about earlier was Philip Tetlock, and he wrote this now famous book called Super Forecasting, where Tetlock was trying to get to the heart of who can make good predictions, and how do they make them, and what makes them good at it. And Tetlock really conducted a very careful, exhaustive scientific study into who is successfully predicting things like elections or world events or important global phenomena, and then how is it that they do it? And he came up with a metric and a way to analyze and figure out how people could do it. And he's gotten actually quite good at it, and he's come up with a bunch of recommendations about how you can be better at it. I highly recommend Tetlock's book, Super Forecasting, where he expands on and unpacks all of these ideas at more length. But I'm going to give it to you kind of quick, his 10 commandments. Okay, so triage. At the front of a decision, focus on the questions where your hard work will pay off. Don't waste time on questions where it's not going to give you a good result. Break seemingly intractable problems into tractable subproblems. Confine the problem into smaller subproblems and figure out those answers to those and then build those back up to these bigger pictures. He gives an example of somebody trying to figure out how many alien civilizations would there be in the world. He probably talks about the Dirac equations in those. Strike the right balance between the inside and outside views. And we're going to hear more about that from Kahneman in just a minute. That is, locally, there's you trying to make your decision on your committee for your company or for your class or your group work or whatever, but then they're both encouraging, Tetlock and Kahneman are encouraging us to be able to step outside and look at ourselves as if we're on the outside looking in and more objectively assess and evaluate our prospects for success compared to other people doing similar things. And the planning fallacy that we'll talk about some more later, and you've talked about from my journal entries, could be seen as a failure to take the outside view. And we'll touch on that in just a minute. Strike the right balance between under and overreacting to the evidence. And that feeds nicely into lots of things Kahneman says about inflating small probabilities or distorting or what's it called, the focusing illusion that's going to come later, that we overreact to some evidence. We minimize the impact of other evidence that actually matters. Look for clashing causal forces at work in each problem. This is one of these principles he lifted from watching these expert forecasters, where they look at the thesis, the antithesis, and then they synthesize those two ideas to draw from Hegel. Strive to distinguish as many degrees of doubt as the problem permits, but no more. There are rarely certain or impossible, find the 40-60 edge. And the idea here is that we tend to think in these binary answers about true or false, but this all this deep dive into probability theory is going to help us to modify to come up with, okay, where's the edge between the 60 and 40 margins? Where's the 30-70 margin? Is this a case where I think it's 30% probable, or is it 40% probable, and why? And as much as your information will permit you, divide up those categories into, whether or not you can make those fine distinctions. Strike the right balance between under and overconfidence. This section of Kahneman's book is about all our overconfidence, between prudence and decisiveness. And if we can scale back or adjust for our overconfidence, it might give us better quality decisions. Look for errors behind your mistakes, but beware of rearview mirror hindsight biases, which feeds into Kahneman. Bring out the best in others and let the others bring out the best in you, and master the error balancing bicycle. Okay, again, he's got chapters on all of this and explains what he's talking about here. So I'll just sketch through all that and then suggest that you go and take a closer look at Tetlock's book. Okay, so next section in Kahneman is this idea about our trusting our quick intuition versus using some sort of formula, algorithm, or statistical prediction rule. Emotional learning is very quick. Recall the Garcia effect. You get some bad food, you get food poisoned, you get a very powerful, quick, emotional, visceral response to it, no pun intended, and you thereafter can't tolerate Indian food or whatever it is that you have a very powerful effect. That makes an indelible mark on mammalian brains. But intellectual learning and training of intuition takes a lot longer. And that's where this idea about 10,000 hours came up. I think Malcolm Gladwell talks about it in Blink, which is also another famous book on intuition. And the idea is, once you've spent 10,000 hours working on some skill, you achieve a special kind of mastery and a development of your nervous system and your cognitive system that gives you these expert intuitions. Maybe it's playing chess or basketball or rock climbing or judging art, or whatever. Once you've had that much time and experience with it, it gives us intimate knowledge and experience with thousands or tens of thousands of configurations of plays or moves that produce expert intuitions. A chess player who's achieved that much chess playing can very quickly look at a chessboard and have a kind of intuitive feel about what operations or what moves or what strategies are likely to succeed and which ones are dead ends, which ones shouldn't they pursue. And this is something that, for instance, we're trying to teach AI systems to be able to do, is to be able to trim down the combinatorial tree of all the possible moves in the future. Because if you look at a Bobby Fischer or a famous chess player, there's whole classes of moves or strategies in a chess game that they won't even go towards because they know that is not promising in the big picture. But an AI system has to figure all that out and has to go probe into those possible futures to decide. So that produces expert intuition in your nervous system that makes it work. Gladwell gives an example of a art and sculpture museum critic who was that a museum made a request of him to look at a sculpture that they had found that they thought was a piece of, I think it was an ancient Chinese statue, that they thought it was authentic. They thought that it fit in this period, and if it did, it would have been, incredibly valuable. And the art critic comes back and says, something about that thing just feels wrong. It felt wrong to me the moment I looked at it. It did not feel right. Something was wrong. It took me a while to figure out what it was, but something about that sculpture was off. And sure enough, they did some more investigating and discovered that the sculpture was actually a fraud. It was fraudulent. It wasn't from this ancient Chinese dynasty, and it wasn't worth anything after the museum had spent, hundreds of thousands of dollars on the thing. So Kahneman points out that what you need then are two conditions to develop expert intuition. You need an environment that's regular enough to be predictable, that's going to give you the feedback you need to be able to train, and then you need the opportunity to learn the regularities through prolonged practice. You need to be able to do it over and over and over again and make adjustments and tune your intuitions and develop this sensitivity to the environment to know what matters and what doesn't matter, when it's going to go wrong, when it's going to go right. And in school, this is the sort of approach I'm taking in many of my classes. What we need is lots of low stakes testing with quick feedback for learning and adjustment. That's how you're going to learn confirmation bias. That's how you're going to learn probability theory, is we do lots and lots of examples. We push forward into the hard ones. We come back into the easier ones, and we develop your intuitions and retrain your ability to do those kinds of problems. Okay, so a new point. There's billions of dollars that are being spent globally on these how to succeed in business books. Any airport bookstore you go to has got a whole display out there of all of these books about how somebody made it with grit, or how they did this remarkable, miraculous startup company in Silicon Valley that made billions of dollars, and so on. And everybody buys those books, reading them, hoping to figure out the secret for how to be successful in business. And in these stories, in these books, skill, knowledge, experience, leadership, insight, confidence, aggression, intelligence, all lead the CEO to his or her amazing success, right? That's the way the story always goes, the story about Google or Facebook or what have you. But what happens is that what's missing from this familiar picture is the role of luck. Very often they just neglect that altogether. Those are non-events. Things that didn't happen, things that did happen by chance, that can make a huge difference in the outcome for something like Google. I mentioned this in the previous lecture. 1 year after their startup, Google founders were willing to sell the company for $1 million, but an investor said that was too high, wouldn't pay it. So they just kept going. And now Google is worth more than $1 trillion, right? They just got lucky there. Or this investor had a bit of bad luck by not seeing what was there. If we had been such good predictors, or been able to see this thing coming the way the excited book about Google's success seems to make it look, as if it was predictable, well, then this guy would, he's an expert investor in Silicon Valley. This guy would have seen it, or somebody else would have seen it, and they would have made, billions of dollars off of it. And they didn't. Very often it's just luck that steers one of these success stories, and it's luck that is very hard for us to predict. And whereas this story about skill and knowledge and expertise is the narrative story that we like, that sort of makes sense, that makes us feel good about this triumph of the human mind and the human reason over the world. Okay, so to deflate our estimations of our own abilities some more, let me talk about statistical prediction rules. Okay, so what are these? In many cases, for lots of human decisions, a simple statistical prediction rule, which is an algorithm that quantifies a few important measures and combines them, performs better than the humans it was based on, who get distracted, hungry, tired, or otherwise inconsistent. Well, what do I mean by that? I'll give you a couple of examples. There's all these books about marital success, or about how do you treat your partner, what do you need to have a winning relationship. Turns out there's a very simple formula that's very powerful and very predictive for whether or not a couple's going to get a divorce. You look at the ratio of how often are they fighting versus how often do they have sex. And if that ratio is high on the sex side and lower on the fighting side, then they're going to do pretty well. You can predict with a pretty high accuracy whether or not a couple is going to end up together 10 years from now by how much sex are they having now versus how much are they fighting. I mean, it's obvious, right? If they're fighting more than they're making up, or they're fighting more than they're loving each other and having sex, then they're doomed. It's not going to go well. And that's a really simple story. It's way more simple than these volumes and volumes, whole sections in the bookstore about how to have a successful relationship, right? I just said it in a sentence. That's all you need. That's the simple rule here that seems to help. Success in college turns out to be predicted on GPA and a simple aptitude test. It will tell us whether or not somebody's going to get through college, and that's pretty much all you need. Once you proportion those, we've had great success figuring out recidivism rates in parole decisions. So you take convicts, you take prisoners who are in prison, and we're trying to decide whether to let them out. And what you're worried about is recidivism, which is them going back to crime after they get out. And it turns out there's some statistical prediction rules that are very good, very simple, that identify a few properties and assign a value to them. And that gives us a pretty good predictor of whether or not that prisoner is going to fall back into crime or whether they're going to go back and be a valuable, successful member of society. Another famous case of a statistical prediction rule that worked was that they gathered together a whole bunch of heart surgeons and heart disease doctors. And they asked them, what are you looking for when you get a person in the ER who's had a heart attack or event with their heart? What are you looking for when you release them and send them home thinking that they're safe to go home versus what do you look for that makes you want to keep them in the hospital for observation? And they pulled a whole bunch of these heart doctors and came up with a half a dozen, I don't remember the details, a half a dozen of simple criteria that seemed to matter in these doctors and their decisions. Then they constructed an SPR based on that set of criteria that the doctors were using, and then started using that to predict whether or not somebody who's sent home is going to end up coming back to the ER with another heart attack. And it turns out the rule that they built based on the doctors actually does better than the doctors themselves. And the reason is that doctors get distracted, they get hungry, they get tired, they're otherwise inconsistent. Things happen, and people get focused on too focused on this detail and not focused enough on this detail, and they lose some of the acumen they might have had otherwise. But if you build this statistical prediction rule that locks it down and says, look for this and this and this, and only those, assign values, and then make your prediction, it is more consistent and reliable than the doctors on which it's based. It's as if we've deduced a rule that is the best, that performs as if the best doctor's performance and eliminates some of their worst performances where they fall off and they perform below their best possibilities. And another really famous, really graphic example here that you might be familiar with if you've had a baby, there's a thing called an APGAR score that we use to evaluate a newborn baby. Here's what happened. Before this Dr. APGAR, nurses and doctors relied on their experience and their judgment at the moment with a newborn baby who might be in trouble. So when a baby's born, it might be crying, it might be pink, it might be bluish, it might be quiet, it might not be breathing well, and so on. And you have to act quickly right then at that moment to get that baby sort of happy and healthy, get the blood flowing, get their lungs going, get their throats cleared, and get it so that they're breathing, and that you get that nice satisfying cry that comes from the baby after it's born. So APGAR realized that we just really need a simple, quick check because seconds matter in this instance, in this situation. You've got to evaluate that baby immediately and then make a decision about what to do with them. So he said, look, what are the newborn's baby's heart rate, respiration rate, reflexes, muscle tone, and color? And what you do is you look at those 5 things and you assign just a simple value, either 0, 1, or 2, to each one of those. So I don't remember how this goes. I think it's a low score. If the heart rate is low, you give it a 1. If the respiration's not happening, you give it a 0. If the reflex is dull, you give it a 1. If the color is blue, you give it a 0. Okay, that's a baby that scores really lowly. So if doctors and nurses have a set of procedures, and if you've got a score below 5, then you do this immediately. You go to the incubator, you go to the intubator, you do X, Y, and Z. If you've got a score that's from 10 to from 5 to 10, for example, you do X, Y, and Z. Or if you've got a score that's 10, then that's a baby that's the highest it can be on all those counts, and that baby's good to go, and that baby doesn't need much work, doesn't need much treatment. Okay, so this thing revolutionized having babies. It saved so many babies' lives because it equalized or evened out what all the doctors and nurses were doing in the delivery room and made it really easy for them to quickly make an evaluation that was consistent, reliable, proven, and it gave us a routine answer to what to do when the kid looks one way versus looks another way. In fact, the numbers are just staggering here. Before APGAR came up with this system, Last year, 120,000 babies in the United States and 15,000 mothers would have died. But using APGAR's system, now those numbers are down to 20,500. Like that's it's 100,000 babies in the country that get saved by just using the simple statistical prediction rule, this simple algorithm that makes a better quality decision than humans who are inconsistent and flighty and chaotic and distracted and tired and what have you, nurses at the end of their shifts and doctors who've delivered 10 babies that day and what have you. All right, so finally, Kahneman talks about the outside, what he calls the outside view, and how to improve local performance. And here's the idea. When you plan or make predictions or predict the future, particularly involving your own performance, you should take the outside view. Okay, so you're on a team at work that's working on a project, or you're on a construction crew that is about to build a garage, or you're a nurse in an emergency room who's trying to, get your rates of people leaving sooner, happier and healthier, down, or I mean up, and you improve your rates on that. So what do? How do you take the outside view? You reflect on how long, how much money, how much energy, how many mistakes people like you in situations like yours typically consumed to do this sort of project. And the thing is that when you're thinking about you doing a project, how long is it going to take me to get to Yosemite? Oh, well, it's going to take 4 hours. What you don't think about is all the ways that goes wrong. You don't think about the traffic. You don't think about the random bad luck things that happen. You don't think about road closures. You don't think about smoke or whatever. You don't think about those. You think about the optimal case scenario. But you should ask yourself, on average, what happens to people when they're doing something like what I'm doing? What do they do? What happens with them? Because they were all optimistic and they all thought it was going to go well too, and it turns out it didn't. Now, the example I use in the Planning Fallacy lecture, which I've noted here in this slide, is bridge building. In almost every case in the United States, when some municipality, some city decides to build a bridge, they get bids from contractors, and the contractors say, yes, we can build that bridge for $10 million, and we'll have it done in 18 months. And then what happens? It takes 6 years, and it costs 6 times what was predicted. All right, it's so predictable, you can see it coming a mile away, that you can almost guarantee that when you go to build or do a big construction project on the highway or something, it's going to take double or triple the time and going to cost 5 times as much as we predicted at the outset, right? Because people failed to recognize the planning fallacy, which is this underestimating of time and energy and work, and underestimating what average performance was in these kinds of cases. And that's because we're optimistic. We assume everything will go smoothly. We think there'll be no delays, no random interruptions. Those are hard to think about. No hazards. We picture everything will go as well as it possibly can without acknowledging how many things are likely to go wrong, even when we should know better from our own past experience. And Kahneman tells a really embarrassing story about him asking these questions of someone who was in a group project with him, and they suddenly realized, oh, wow, nobody's ever done this sort of project in the time we've allotted, and I was assuming we could, and turns out it always takes them 7 or 8 years, and I was thinking it would just take us 1.5 years. So taking the outside view and averaging like that can give you a much more realistic attitude about how much time is it going to take you to study for your classes, how many units of school can you take during the semester and succeed and still get the grades you want, how many hours at work can you work, and all of that. You're committing the planning fallacy in those kinds of cases, and it's because you're failing to take the outside view. We commit the planning fallacy, and when we ask, how long do people, including me, usually take to do this task really? How much money does it take? How much investment? How and in what ways am I different from everyone else who's tried to do it? Why am I different? Why am I better than average? Build this bridge, take this class, get straight A's. Why am I above average? Why am I thinking that I'm going to do better than everybody else here? Or why am I thinking I'm going to do better than my past performance? Right? And this is a little bit discouraging, but in Kahneman's view, it will give us a more realistic answer to, and will make better predictions about our plans if we can make this modification and adopt the outside view when necessary. The inside view, the narrow view, misleads, misrepresents, operates with this what you see is all there is. It ignores regression. It commits hindsight bias. It suffers from the illusion of validity and skill, and so on. All right, so to talk about Dennett McKay again here, their discussion of positive illusions really fits well. Again, Dennett McKay argue that optimal mental health is associated with unrealistically positive self-appraisals and beliefs. So they actually argue, they settle on positive illusions as being one of the categories of misbelief that seems to have evolved. And it looks like it may have evolved because that helps us succeed. It helps keep up optimal mental health if you've got this kind of delusional, optimistic attitude about how well you're going to do. Because the realistic view, the pessimistic view, the realism view looks at the world and says, the world's too much, the problems are too hard, the challenges are too vast, I can't possibly succeed against all this. If you had underconfidence or pessimism bias, you'd just slump into failure and give up. But it turns out that if we've got unrealistically positive self-evaluations, exaggerated perceptions of personal control or mastery, and unrealistic optimism about the future, that keeps us going, that keeps us throwing ourselves at these hard problems, and sometimes it works. So it looks like we're probably built to do that. And I guess I'm sort of split here because Kahneman seems to be recommending that we try to control for and correct optimism bias, but Dennett and McKay are arguing that there's a positive, or there's an evolutionary function, there's an adaptive function here that seems to help us. Maybe we'd be better off, at least if we understand that it's working in ourselves, when we think that we're better looking, better drivers than everybody else, and so on, right? I'm better than average. I'm more intelligent, more honest, more persistent, original, friendly, reliable. I'm going to live longer. I'm a better than average teacher. I'm a better driver, and I'm less prone to self-serving distortions, and so on, right? Those are all traits that are subjective and socially desirable, as we said before. And the problem is that veridical judgments, that is accurate judgments or realistic judgments, are self-limiting. Routine exaggerations of self-efficacy lead us to keep trying and exert extra effort to surpass ordinary performance. So maybe it's good for us to have this kind of delusional optimism about, I'm great at this, or I'm going to make it, or I'm going to pull it off, or my kids are really smart, my kids are really good looking, despite their being a serial killer or what have you. And Kahneman talks about this, the problem here with optimism, and I'm not sure what we should make of this. Look, it turns out that only 35% of small businesses will actually survive 5 years. That the market forces are it's just too difficult to get a small business like a restaurant up and running. It's just very, very hard. Chances are very good that you'll fail at starting a new business. But what do people do? They inevitably do it. You see them pop up all over town. They say, hey, let's open a custom artisan handcrafted paper and handmade soap store in this old storefront with no parking in a bad neighborhood, right? That's a case I've just seen in my neighborhood down the street. And I'll use my retirement savings. It'll be great. We'll get lots of people in there and they'll want to buy our handmade paper and our handmade soap, right? It's that kind of sort of delusional thinking and optimism about your success that leads lots of people just to lose their money and lose their retirement savings. So on the one hand, that makes me sort of want to dampen down people's enthusiasm and optimism for these kinds of things. You know, I'm kind of killing their dreams here. And Kahneman is, but that's your money and that's your retirement savings. So maybe you ought to mitigate or at least recognize how these positive illusions are feeding into your prediction about what's going to unfold in the future. So when you ask these people before they fail, what are the odds that any business like yours will succeed? People will say, oh, I put it at about 60%. They have this rosy, optimistic view about their success probability, and they think it's 60% when in fact it's only 35%. So they're overly optimistic here. Most people believe they are superior to most others on most desirable traits, as we saw from Dennett and McKay. Okay, so Kahneman's solution here, his answer is that we should take the outside view and downgrade your optimism to realism. On the inside view, when you're inside the committee or you're setting up your business or you're trying to succeed or what have you, you ask yourself, what are the outcomes that I want? What are the methods and skills that I have to achieve these outcomes? And then from the outside view, you go, how do people usually do when they tackle this sort of project, this sort of business, or this many hours in college or try to build a bridge or whatever? What is the average performance, the time it takes to build the bridge, the money it takes to build the bridge, or the average performance of dropping out of classes or getting grades? How does my skill set or my resources compare to those other people who pursue this project? Comparing myself to people on the outside is going to give me a better, more realistic attitude about whether or not what my prospects are. What is their average outcome, and why would I do better than them? How long does it take them? And let's avoid the planning fallacy here when we do those kinds of assessments. Okay, so into part two. In part one of this discussion, we talked about those five highlights, those parts of Kahneman's chapters with a couple of my additions. And in part two of these lectures about chapters 19 through 24, we've talked about the illusion of validity, the illusion of skill, expert intuition, formulas, statistical prediction rules, the outside view, optimism, and planning fallacy. That's the end of part two of these lectures.